2 weeks ago, we began our study of the book of Romans. Paul, writing to the church in Romans, introduces himself. In the first part of chapter 1, we see Paul identifying himself as a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. Paul's calling as an apostle was to bring the gospel or the good news to the Gentiles and bring them through faith to a life of obedience to God. Paul indicates that he's not ashamed of the good news of Jesus Christ. Today, we will continue our study of Romans and examine the last half of chapter 1. Let's begin by reading chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since they may be known about God, so what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. In the first part of chapter 1, which we looked at 2 weeks ago, Paul speaks of the relationship with God that man can enter into through faith to a life of obedience. Beginning in verse 18, Paul changes course and focuses on the wrath of God on the person that has chosen to ignore God and not submit to his authority. When we think of wrath, we often think of someone that's very angry. However, the Bible never speaks of God being angry. It only speaks of God's love. Many people have an incorrect perception that God is an angry God. God is not an angry God. He is a God of love, a God that loves us. William Barclay writes, the whole message of the Hebrews prophets is that there was a moral order in this world. The conclusion is clear, that moral order is the wrath of God at work. God made this world in such a way that we break his law at our own peril. In other words, the wrath of God is not a result of God's anger, but it's a result of natural consequences of the choices that people make who choose to reject God. The wrath of God is not revealed in the gospel. The good news that Paul speaks of in the beginning of the chapter, rather, is revealed in God's creation. The complexity of the creation, the order that is found in creation. It's obvious that to someone who thoughtfully ponders the creation, that this world with its ecosystem, its plants, its animals, and its people could not have happened by chance. Rather, that exists by a grand designer, that is God. To look at creation with all its splendor, we see God's eternal and divine power. It makes us realize that God is so much more than we can comprehend, and we can realize how far we are removed from him. Isaiah 55, verse 8 and 9 speak of the chasm between the morality of God and the morality of man. It goes like this. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Creation speaks to us and reveals our need for God. If you look at how the world works, we see that suffering follows sin. If you put your hand in the fire, it will burn you. If you overeat, you will have health problems. If you drink too much alcohol, it will destroy your liver. If you smoke cigarettes, it probably will give you cancer. If you fail to plant a harvest, you will go hungry. If you fail to practice the laws of architecture, your building will collapse. Suffering follows sin. Unfortunately, some have repressed or hindered this truth, this principle, that suffering follows sin that we find in all of creation. They refuse to acknowledge God and his sovereignty. They refuse to bend their knee to his authority. They have rejected God. They have chosen to deny their need for God. These are the people by their own choosing that will incur the wrath of God. They are without excuse. Let's continue reading verses 21 through 23. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Instead of looking to God, they looked to themselves. They traded God's standards for man-made standards. You may have heard people will use the phrase, my truth. They've traded God's truth for their own opinions, their own speculation. They've traded God's truth for a lie. They've created their own God out of selfish motives, a God that is manipulated to fulfill the will of the worshiper. What you end up with is adultery. The foundation of adultery is selfishness. The adulterer's worship is for his own sake and not for God's sake. There's no such thing as my truth. There's only God's truth. Let's continue reading verses 26 through 28. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. And going on, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to the depraved mind so that they do what ought not to be done. When man abandons God, there's a downward spiral. There's a downward spiral that is moral decay that takes place in society. Paul is writing to the church in Rome, and Rome, it was no stranger to immorality. In the first 520 years of Roman history, there's not a single divorce recorded. But during the time of Paul's writing, women were married to be divorced and divorced to be married. Juvenal writes, Agrippina, the empress herself, the wife of Claudius, who at night used to leave the royal palace and go down to serve in the brothel for the sake of sheer lust. 14 of the first 15 Roman emperors were homosexuals. Barclay writes that society from the top to the bottom was riddled with unnatural vice. So when Paul is speaking of men and women abandoning natural relations with one another and engaging in homosexuality, this was not some foreign idea to the Romans, but it was something that they had seen in society, and possibly some had even previously engaged in it. This downward spiral of morality we see in the history of Rome. Today, it can also be seen in the US as well as many countries around the world. For those who have rejected God, we see the agenda of ungodliness that is promoted on social media, in the press, in television, and in movies. 50 years ago, there was never any sexual scenes on television. In fact, in television shows, if it showed the bedroom, it was the bedroom of a married couple. They had separate beds. From there, we've gradually begun to see unmarried couples having sex on television. If you look at television today, almost all scenes that depict sex are between unmarried couples. Vulgarity is another area that's crept into television and movies. Now, it's not uncommon to hear all kinds of profanity in movies and on television. It's been promoted to the point that an outsider would think that all people talk like that. And of course, the big push today by these ungodly people is to promote homosexuality and transgenderism. Yes, our nature, our nation, our world, it's spiraling down in emotion to a world of wickedness. This lack of morality is a result of rejection of God. I've had a conversation with a former pastor, not a Baptist pastor, about homosexuality. He believes that it's fine for same-sex couples to marry and engage in sexual relations. His rationale is that the Old Testament law is a thing of the past. It's true that we're not under the rabbinical requirements of the Jewish law, but God does not change under the new covenant, under the blood of Jesus. God is the same yesterday and today and tomorrow. God does not change. God hated immorality before Jesus came on the scene, and he continues to hate immorality. Here in chapter 1 of Romans, Paul makes it very clear that homosexuality is immoral. I think Paul focused on the sin of homosexuality to begin with because it was so prevalent in Rome. But this is only one sin. Because of the rejection of God and his truth, God gave them over to their own shameful lust. But Paul doesn't stop with homosexuality. In verse 28 through 32, he identifies many behaviors that ungodly people engage in. Let's look at verses 28 through 32. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to depraved minds, so that they do not do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Paul pictures men and women who are spiritually bankrupt. They have created their own truth. They have rejected God's truth. When this type of behavior becomes prevalent in a society, that society is doomed. It's not a society worth living in. So, is there hope for a society that is spiritually bankrupt? Like Rome, is the United States destined for the garbage heap of history? 2 Chronicles 7:14 offers the only hope for a land that has turned its back on God. Excuse me. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. Who is called to pray and seek God's face and turn from the wicked ways? It's not the non-Christian, but it's the people of God. Each of us need to be calling out to God and asking him to forgive us individually and turning from evil. And not only that, we need to be asking God to forgive us the sins of our society. Then and only then will God forgive us and heal our land.